Hi, this is Thomas from Believe in the Run.
And this is Meghann from Believe in the Run.
And this is Meghann from Featherstone Nutrition.
AKA Feathers.
And you're listening to Fuel for the Soul.
It's awesome. It's our show about nutrition and running and like what you need to eat so that you run better. So you run good.
So you run good, kid.
So eat this, run good. Actually, it's not that simple.
It's just that simple.
It's not. That's why we have Meghann on, or Feathers, because she knows a thing or two, not just like because she read some Instagram posts and was like, yeah, you need to hydrate. No, she's actually, you're like almost practically like a learned doctor almost.
I mean, I don't have a PhD, but there's a master's degree in nutrition. So we're like kind of headed that way, but
Well, you don't have to operate on anyone, so that's probably good enough.
And everyone is happy that I'm not operating on people. I'll just tell you what to eat.
Yeah.
So before we dive into our listener question, let's talk about our sponsor, Inside Tracker. Thomas, what is Inside Tracker?
Funny you should ask. Inside Tracker is an ultra-personalized nutrition platform that uses blood work to create one-of-a-kind, science-backed action plan to help you reach your potential for better performance and a longer, healthier life.
Yeah, so they were founded in 2009, and the Boston company first started working with professional athletes who wanted to see what their biomarkers, hormone, and mineral profiles look like during their training and how they could use nutrition and lifestyle to improve.
Get this, they measure over 30 biomarkers and recommend food and supplements to optimize things like your energy, cognition, endurance, heart health, and more.
And the really great news for you all is for a limited time, Inside Tracker is offering our listeners 25% off their entire store.
Boom.
Just go to insidetracker.com/fuel. All right, so let's dive into this week's listener question.
How come people aren't recording them? Why are we getting so many written in? Go to the app, record it, because we love to hear your voice.
It is fun to hear your voice, so do that.
Anchor app, submit your question. But we are so happy this week that we have a written one. Now that I've said that. So who's it from, Meg?
This is from Sarah Hanson. And Sarah wrote, I loved the post on carbs today. This was my biggest challenge with my 70.3 that I just did, even from doing marathons. When not training high volume, what is the appropriate amount of carbs per meal, per day, for weight maintenance, for weight loss? Should they be different?
And let me guess, it's the same for everyone, right?
Blanket, right? That's why I have a great job here, is that we all need the exact same thing. And this is a question I get a lot. And I think, we want to be thinking about what type of work we are expecting of our bodies. So, to take a step back, right? If we're really talking about what fuels our bodies, it's macronutrients. So we get energy, we get fuel from fat, from carbs, and from protein. And I think some of the misconception on carbs is really the only macronutrient that we need to flex with our amount of training. So there are very, I don't want to say rigid or strict, but kind of, right? There's very research-based guidelines that the more hours we spend training, the more carbs we need. So, if we're doing very little exercise, we need like 3 grams per kilogram of carbohydrates per day. If we're doing more, we need more like 5 to 7. If we're doing a lot, we need more like 10. So as you can see, it scales, right? So I think, an easier message to understand is the more miles we're running, the more carbohydrates that our body needs, because that's the type of fuel that is fueling most of our runs, especially when they're at a higher intensity.
Let me ask you a question about that, because we're doing the grit. So I'm putting in more miles than normal, and my body is naturally like wanting to just devour. And there's certain things that I want, like, the easy, the fast, which is typically carbs. So, I'm watching what I eat a little bit better. But during this time, I'm like, hey, if I'm hungry, eat. Will our body and will your brain just automatically trigger these things for you, and you shouldn't limit if that's what your body's saying?
Thomas, you're a well-oiled machine with food cues like that. So some people are, to your point, some people their hunger ramps up as their mileage ramps up. But there's a lot of people out there that the opposite happens, especially when we're training through the heat in the summer, right? So we're getting these gritty miles in July. So it's hot, it's humid, where our miles are increasing. And a lot of times people's appetites actually kind of tank during that time. So for some people, we can rely on that appetite. So to your point, Thomas, if you're super hungry and you're like, wow, I need more carbs, or I need a side of pretzels with this meal, like definitely lean into that. But for a lot of people, we have to go above and beyond and actually plan for it, make sure we're eating enough, because the likelihood of underfueling over the summer as mileage is increasing, I see it much more often this time of year than I do in the winter. I don't know if we're all like bearing down for winter and like want to eat more carbs, and summer is, I don't know. I think it's the heat more than anything, but just something to be aware of.
I find that I noticed recently on my long runs, which are starting to pick up now a little bit and getting a little bit longer, I do not want to take in nutrition out on the run because I'm sweating and it's hot, and it's like the last thing I want to do is suck down the goo.
Yeah. Well, that's the thing. It's gross to eat a salty, sweet, hot pocket of goo when you're out on that run. I mean, it's nasty.
Yes, you're right. When it's warm, or even if your like scratch gets warm, like it's harder to take. But also, I mean, to your point, your body's taking a lot of that blood, right, to get oxygen to our muscles, but then also some of that blood is trying to dissipate heat. So there's just less perfusion to our GI tract when it's hot out. So it makes sense that your body's almost, I don't know, maybe being a little bit protective of like, do you really want this gel right now? Right. So sometimes we have to override that.
And if you're sweating, you're probably starting to get dehydrated, and your body probably doesn't want to take in, food that it has to devote to digestion.
Right. I think our appetite tanks when we get dehydrated too. I think sometimes those two things go hand in hand.
Which is great because I look better after those runs because I've lost like 5-10 pounds of water weight. And that's when I like to get on the scale.
That finish line marathon photo, nice and dehydrated. That's what Thomas is going for.
I often run an hour or so before I race just to get that body for the
that chiseled look. There you go.
So we
don't recommend that.
This is slightly off topic, but it kind of reminded me as we were talking about this whole idea of intuitive eating, which I feel like is a buzzword in the nutrition world. I'm sure you get it, or the question a lot. Mm-hmm. So like, is that something that we should be thinking about? Like, should we be eating intuitively, or like, because when I'm hot, the last thing I want to do is take a goo? Is that not necessarily the best thing to do?
So this is a bold statement, but I know you guys know that I tell it like it is. I do not think intuitive eating is appropriate for runners who are competing, right, at a higher level, who are training at a higher level. I think we can use bits and pieces of intuitive eating into a healthy diet. But if we try to rely solely on intuitive eating, the likelihood that we're going to miss certain windows, miss performance fueling, because our bodies aren't giving us the cues that we should be relying on to fuel appropriately when we're running that type of mileage.
I think it really also depends on the person, because I think that intuitive eating works if you actually listen to the cues. Like for me, I'm like, okay, I'm hungry, I'm going to eat. And for you, you're like, nah, I want to get to a race weight or whatever. So like, I feel like you would take the excuse to not necessarily eat, even if your body was like, hey, it'd be a good time for a goo right now. You're like, I'm almost home, whatever.
Mm-hmm. And I think we train our bodies, or we push down the cues that our body gives us sometimes, right? Like if we ignore hunger long enough, our body's going to quit telling us we're hungry, right? So if we're working with somebody trying to get them to eat enough that never feels hunger because they've ignored it for years and years and years and years, I guess a true intuitive eating counselor would say, okay, but there's other cues that person is hungry, right? Like fatigue or crabbiness or irritability or something like that we would tune into instead of hunger. But it's super nuanced, right? I mean, it's not just cut and dry as eat when you're hungry, stop when you're full. That's not going to work for most runners.
Okay, so let's go back to this big picture, macronutrients. We've got the fat, we've got the protein, we've got the carbs. Is there a general ratio for runners that you recommend, or is it really, really individualized?
So it's all based on our body weight. So when we look at the general, population's diet, we look at the food guide pyramid from back in the day, which is now My Plate. It's all percentages, right? We want to eat X percentage of this and X percentage of that. But that's where it's very different for endurance athletes. We look at the person, right? Take their body weight, transfer it over into kilograms, and then we have grams of protein per kilogram, grams of carbs per kilogram. And then we split that up throughout the day. So I think sometimes it gets frustrating because a lot of sports nutrition research will use percentages of total calories. And, that's where things get a little skewy because a lot of times we're not comparing apples to apples here, right? If somebody's under fueling, 75% of total carbohydrates is still not enough for that person, right? Whereas if someone's eating enough, 75% of carbohydrates might be enough. So we can kind of equalize that playing field a little bit by, going by grams per kilogram for the athlete.
You keep saying kilogram. Are you from Canada?
Do I say it weird?
No.
Is it kilogram?
No, we use pounds down here.
Oh, I see what you're saying.
Imperial system. No, in all seriousness though, for her question, she's talking about upping her mileage and doing 70.3s and which is taking the swim and the biking and the running. So you're burning a ton more calories. Is there a formula for her, or unless she goes to a nutritionist and says, okay, here's a plan and this is what you're doing. Here's how much you weigh. This is what we should be looking for. Okay, you want to lose a little weight? All right, we drop this down by X percent. You want to, gain performance? We up it by a little bit. If somebody is just a novice and they just want to know, is it just, hey, add an extra bagel here, add an extra pretzel here, add, these things so that you can perform better?
So I think both, right? Obviously, I push for people to work with sports dietitians, but I think it's good that we have some knowledge and can calculate some stuff ourselves as well. So truthfully, the easiest thing is exactly what you said. Like, let's add a serving of carbohydrates at every meal and have a carby snack. So, add a half a cup, add a cup of pasta or rice to what you're already eating, add a bagel to something, add a bunch of pretzels to a snack. I think that's the easiest way. And truthfully, if you're under fueling and not getting enough carbs, if you do that for 2 or 3 days and you feel better, boom, there you go. Right. You weren't eating enough carbs. Like we don't have to do a ton of calculations, but for people who like those numbers, right? Sometimes I can really get people to open their eyes like, oh my gosh, I'm so far from where I need to be. Right. If for somebody who's training for a 70.3, so if they're training for over, an hour a day, an hour to 3 hours a day, they need at least 6 to 10 grams per kilogram of carbohydrates. So if you calculate that out, for a 150-pound athlete, that's like over 400 grams of carbs. So it's a lot, right? It's probably a lot more than most people are getting, but I don't think we all need to necessarily calculate it out. To your point, Thomas, I think, trial and error is an awesome way to determine what works for us.
So quick question on that. We have our watches and our stuff now that tell us, hey, you burned X number of calories. And I know they're going off a general idea of what we weigh from what we put in there. People fluctuate greatly. My weight is, like I said, after I've run and complete heat and I'm pretty much squeezed dry. But it's going off of that and calculating how many calories we burn. And people get excited about that. You see a workout. Like I remember yesterday I told Meghann, I was like, I burned 2,000 calories. And she's like, according to what? How much can you trust these measurements and stuff on your watch?
So, there's a lot that goes into calculating energy expenditure. So the generic, right, is height, weight, age. So we've programmed all of that into our Garmin apps or Coros apps or whatever we're using. So those 3 things are there. But then the biggest variable there is exertion. So it's basing our exertion on heart rate, which we know these wrist heart rates sometimes work, sometimes don't. I mean, I don't know about you guys, but mine goes wonky in the cold. Like sometimes it'll tell me my heart rate was 190 the whole time. So of course it's going to say I burned 2,000 calories, right? Because it thinks my heart is bursting out of my chest and I'm working really hard. Whereas if you had, a shirt on under your watch and it said your heart rate was never over 100, you would notice the calorie burned was much, much lower for that run, right? And those aren't accurate. Those are extremes. So, if we could accurately depict, how hard we're working, what our intensity is, and it knew a little bit more about our body composition, right? That's the other thing. It doesn't know okay, it knows I weigh X amount of pounds, but how much of that's fat, how much of that's muscle, right? That's going to be different for everybody. So those are kind of the two unknowns, right? Is body composition isn't in there, and then actual exertion on that run isn't in there. So those are the two things that would make it a little bit less accurate overall. But they're a decent idea, right? They're a decent feel for it.
So could you use that though, like when Ms. Hanson's talking about how much carbohydrates she needs, and you know that she says, okay, on average, I'm burning this many calories per workout or per day. How do I calculate how I could replace that with carbs or not replace it? Like if someone, it seems like a lot of people want to be a little bit under. How do they calculate that using that kind of information?
Yeah. So I think, what you're hitting on, and also what we haven't really answered from Sarah quite yet, is I see a lot of athletes struggling with the extremes. So they know kind of how to fuel their baseline activity, but when they're resting, right? Or when they're injured, or when when there's that extreme, right? I think she's mentioning after a 70.3, what do I do? But then also I see the dialing up from this is normal. Now I'm hitting peak training. So when we're going either way, I see people really struggle with, I don't know what to do. I'm good at the middle ground, right? But what do I do from here? So I guess you probably could use those calorie burns a little bit. But honestly, what I try to tell people is just because, even if we were totally sedentary, that doesn't mean we don't need carbs. Like our brain and our body prefer to run off of carbs. So even if we were laying in bed all day for an entire week, we still need like 130 grams of carbs just for our body per day, just for our body to do what it wants to do on a daily basis. Now, we know if we don't eat carbs, we can use fat for fuel, right? That's the whole premise of keto and Atkins and low carb diets. So we can do it, but it's not what our bodies prefers, right? It's going to prefer, and it's going to run the best off of carbohydrates. So I always try to throw that 130 grams out there because I have a lot of athletes that are training that are barely eating that, right? And that's what our body needs without training. So a lot of times it's really kind of understanding that we still need carbs. We just don't need as many. So for a lot of people, we still need at least 200 grams of carbs a day, even if we're not doing much.
What is 200 carbs a day?
400.
What would that look like?
So like a cup of cooked pasta or rice is about like 45 or 50, right? So it would be like a cup of starchy carbs at each meal plus some sort of carb at a snack or 2 pieces of fruit, throughout the day. 2 slices of bread would be 50 grams, right? So you could have a sandwich with 2 slices of bread and an apple. Like that would just be totally normal for somebody not doing a ton of exercise. But it's hard, right? To figure out how to scale that exactly. From that standpoint. And I do see a lot of people. I was glad that Sarah asked this question because I see a lot of people really struggling with that carb piece on either extreme.
Can you give us like the sciencey nerd data? Like why are carbs so important and what is it doing to help us for our performance?
Wait, you're asking Feathers if she can give us a nerdy answer?
Yeah.
Nerd alert. So what are carbs doing for our performance?
Yeah.
Is that what you're kind of getting at? Yeah. So they've got some really cool graphs, which I'm sure I have saved on Instagram somewhere in some sort of highlight, where they look at how hard you're working. So your percent of your VO2 max, right? So like, are we working at a very low percentage? Are we just out trotting or are we working really hard? And the really cool thing that we see is as that intensity increases, our reliance on carbohydrates increases. So when we're running really slow, we can burn fat for fuel. When we're running really fast, we need carbs. So a good way to remember that is like, if you're going to fill up a sports car, you're using like the best gas, right? But if you're going and, filling up your dump truck that doesn't need to run very fast, you can put, other types of fuel into it, right? So, if we've got a sports car engine, we're running off of carbs, right? If we're a dump truck, we can run off of fat more easily. So those slow, sustainable efforts, we can use fat because fat is a really slow fuel source. It takes our body a very long time to break that fat and create that energy, that ATP, that actually fuels our muscles. That's just a very slow process from fat. And it's a very fast process from carbs. So that's why if we're going for a PR, if we're going for a hard training session, we have to have carbs that we've eaten, carbs stocked in our muscles as glycogen to quickly break down. So we have that fast carbohydrate fuel to really fuel those muscles. Some studies they look at will show you that hitting the wall at the end of a marathon is when our body has run out of stored glycogen and we're not taking in any more gels at that point, or we haven't recently, and we start to only run on fat. That's when our body's just like, boom, I can't go fast anymore, right? And our paces start to suffer, given that we've paced ourselves well and all that jazz. But, from a nutrition standpoint, that's why you would hit the wall, is because the carbs are gone, right? And you're trying to rely on this really slow fat for fueling.
So when you say fat's really slow, does that mean like I can start a really slow run and eventually I will start to feel okay? Like it works in that way? Or it's just like, it's just really slow all the time?
So it's going to stay the same pace, right? I think maybe what you're thinking is like, if I've broke some fat down at the beginning, will I be able to like run a little faster because it's already broken down? That's a good question. Not to my knowledge, right? I don't think that that's going to, be obviously the preferential fuel source, but it's just, if you think of a fat, it's a bunch of carbon molecules and it's like, we have to break them all up, right? And it's just a tough process.
I'm thinking that you could compare it to your lighter fluid would be carbs, easy to burn, highly combustible, and the briquette would be your fat. So once it starts burning, it's hard to get it going, but once it starts burning, you get that nice slow burn that can help make your chicken taste really good.
Great analogy, Thomas.
All right, there we go. Let's have a barbecue.
Okay, so without working with you or a sports dietitian, are there some signs that will let you know if you are not taking in enough carbs during training?
Mm-hmm. I think most of us are experienced enough runners that we know what paces should feel like, right? Sure, we have certain days where easy runs feel hard and hard runs feel easy. But when time and time again, the paces that we should be hitting just don't feel achievable anymore, that could mean that we're a little bit low on carbs. If we can't sustain a workout, right? Like if we've got, a well-coached or well-organized plan that's progressive, that we should be able to progress, more miles at a certain pace or more repetitions at a certain pace, and we just can't seem to nail that like we should be able to, that would mean we probably don't have enough carbs around. And then the other thing that's been really fascinating to me recently is I've had a whole slew of females coming to me that have been under fueling. And once we get them fueling enough, specifically with carbs, they are sleeping better. So, if you think about it, like, right? It's amazing. And it's all these little things that they're like, okay, it's not just as easy as, hey, eat enough carbs to fuel your performance. There's just so many things attached to that, right? So if I can help people find those little things that they're like, oh my gosh, I'm sleeping better, or, oh my gosh, I'm running better. It's those little things that are like, all right, get people to buy in to the fact that we really do need to fuel well.
All right, guys, jumping in here to remind you about our sponsor, Inside Tracker.
So if you're listening before you know already, they measure over 30 biomarkers and recommend food, supplements to optimize things like energy, cognition, endurance, heart health, and more.
And for a limited time, Inside Tracker is offering our listeners 25% off their entire store. Just go to insidetracker.com/fuel.
Do it.
I have to bring this up because it was a big topic last week or 2 weeks ago. I can't remember, but someone posted that women cannot carb load, and you explained on your Instagram why this is probably inaccurate. Can you talk to us?
Wait, was it a man who said women can't carb load?
No, it was not.
Okay, because that would have been the best.
Yeah, so I got a little fiery about this comment because, as you can imagine from our conversation we've been having here for the past few minutes, is most females are not taking in adequate carbs, period, right? So then we read this, very clickbait Instagram post that pops up in everybody's face that says women can't adequately carb load. So what do I fear? Okay, all my female athletes are gonna be like, see, told you, Meghann, we can't do it anyways. We're not eating carbs, right? So I'm like, oh no, we can't have this, right?
Go back to your 14-minute pace.
Right. So, of course, all the studies were linked in this post, which was wonderful. So I pulled all those studies and read them for myself, right? To take a look at, clearly I did not believe this post, but let's take a look, right? I'm very open-minded. Let's take a step back. Like, have I missed something in the research? Is there something that I need to be enlightened on? So I read through it all, and, immediately the first thing that popped out at me was, what they were doing in the studies that showed that women could not effectively carb load, they weren't eating enough carbs. So if you look at the recommendations, we need over 8 grams per kilogram to effectively carb load. And one of the studies had 5.5 grams per kilogram. One of the studies had 6. Like, it's not enough. So of course it didn't work. Like, so to me, that's not earth-shattering science. That's literally just, you weren't adhering to the guidelines of sports nutrition for adequately carb loading.
So should the study be women can't carb load if you don't give them carbs?
Right. And so the reason they were pulling it out that women can't was because most of these studies were head to head with men. And they're small studies. It's like 8 women, 8 men, but the men adequately carb loaded. But when you looked at how many carbs they were eating, their normal diet gave them almost 9 grams per kilogram of carbs. And the women's normal diet was like 5. Right. And again, that's equalizing to body composition. So it should be comparing apples to apples, but we weren't, because women weren't eating as many carbs as men. And that's why it didn't work. So really the message should be just eat enough.
Yeah. Before working with you, Meg's lunch was basically lettuce.
I was failing. We all know I was failing at the nutrition.
No, it's not failing. I think that you were doing what intuitively, bring up intuitive diet again. You thought, okay, I want to have this. I'm eating healthy. I'm eating lettuce, and what else was in those salads? Spinach.
It was first of all, it was not enough food. It was not calorie dense, and there was little to no carbs in them. And this actually brings me to my next question, because I think we are ingrained to believe that eating carbs equals weight gain. It doesn't matter how many, it doesn't matter when.
If it tastes good, you're going to get fat.
If it's a carb, it's going to turn into fat on you. Like, that has been driven into our brains. And I think even like subconsciously, I was making food choices based off of that thought.
And I don't know where that thought came from. Like, honestly, it is so just grossly inaccurate, because if we really look at the science, if we eat carbs and we eat extra carbs, the first place they're going to go is stored glycogen. Right? So we are going to store those carbohydrates with some water in our muscles or our liver for a fuel source. Right? And then if we keep overeating and we keep eating more, okay, yeah, anything that we eat in excess is going to turn to fat. Anything, protein, fat, carbs, all of it. Right? But to your
Slurpees,
point, I think for whatever reason, carbs have been more so demonized as making people fat. And, one of the things that always comes to my mind is, for someone who's been on a low carb diet, right? They see the scale drop really fast because we, to the earlier point, prefer carbohydrates. But so we burn through those glycogen stores. We use that as energy first. And with every gram of carb we use, we lose 3 or 4 grams of water. So of course we see the scale go down 5 or 6 pounds, because we're losing all this water weight that just happened to go along with these carbs that our body was like, oh my God, give me those carbs that you still have there. Right. And we use that all up. So then as soon as you eat carbs, you store glycogen again, you see that scale go up, because we store water with glucose to make glycogen. So all you see that becomes this vicious cycle.
Which is stop drinking water.
That's Thomas's takeaway.
The water's making me
just
fat.
Wants to look chiseled with his dehydrated.
Well, speaking of water, you were drinking a key lime. Is it LaCroix? I don't even know how to say it. Yeah. Which I also have purchased recently. And I think our listening audience would want to know, what is your favorite flavor that doesn't always go on sale at Aldi?
It depends on what Aldi's have. There's, I don't know if they're new, but they were new to Aldi. They have a blackberry one that was really good, but I really do like the key lime. Ever since quarantine, I've gotten on this sparkling water kick, and I don't know what my problem is. I have been drinking a ton of it.
Meghann is addicted to sparkling water. Like, can you drink flat water anymore?
Sometimes. Like, but we have a whole bottle. Like, we have a mini fridge in our kitchen that most people would put like beer and wine in, and ours is just sparkling water.
That's what this is. Ours is here too.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah.
So you get it.
Sure. Oh, I mean, we might have a sparkling water drinking competition when we see each
I
other.
say we add a little
Who
White
has
Claw.
the most can carnage?
White Claw and Truly's in there, and see how you girls really go.
Blind taking them out.
Be like, is this sparkling water or alcoholic sparkling water? You tell me.
Blindfold us.
Yeah.
Okay. I had a few more questions. Oh, this one, because Thomas and I very much disagree on this. I always want to eat the whole wheat bread or pasta, and he is like, give me the white, straight up pasta that you can
I don't
have.
want the compromise. The difference is you get the wheat ones are harder. Like they're harder to chew. It's just not as pleasurable an experience.
See, and I think they taste better. And I feel like there's more nutrients in them, but you tell us, what should we be doing?
I think they both have their place, truthfully.
Okay.
Okay, go ahead, Thomas.
I was going to say, you don't look Italian to me, but that's all I'm going to say.
No. My pasty white skin give me away.
I'm thinking, Eastern. Wait, is it Eastern European? There we go.
Oh yeah, I'm a big mutt, but yeah, my mom has red hair and freckles, and
right.
so
there we go.
Got light eyes, light skin. So white pasta or wheat pasta. So I think they both have their place. So to kind of separate them a little bit, one would be more of like a performance fuel option and one would be more of like a daily fuel option. So when we're running, we are hungry, right? And we want to stay satisfied. We want to stay full. So choosing something like whole wheat bread or whole wheat pasta has fiber in it. So it's going to keep us full longer. So like on the daily, I think we should be leaning a little bit more towards the whole grains. To Meg's point too, is they've got more nutrition in them because the white stuff, we strip it all out and then try to add it back in. But like you guys know, like white bagels are my go-to performance fuel. So like to eat before a long run, to eat when I'm carb loading. I personally can't handle, I could never carb load on whole wheat,
disgusting
products. It would be too much fiber. So I would have to eat the white stuff, right?
Whole wheat
but some
bagels.
people can carb load on the whole wheat, right? Do they even make those? I don't know.
Yeah, they do. And they also make whole wheat, English muffins, which also taste like trash bags.
Oh, I don't mind those.
Yeah,
trash bags.
You and Meghann. Right.
You eat a lot of trash bags in your life?
I do. Before Meghann came along and would prepare meals for me, I was mostly eating out of garbage cans.
Okay, so the moral of the story is they're both okay, but generally, if you're eating dinner, whole grain, whole wheat.
If you want to feel more satiated and have more fiber in your system, the whole wheat will help you feel full longer and probably is better for your digestion.
You got it.
So fueling, we know like we have to be taking in adequate carbs during the day. Now when we're talking about specifically racing, so let's say we're outside running pretty hard for an hour, 2 hours, 3 hours. Is there a recommended grams we should be taking in?
During the run?
Yes.
Yeah. So generically, I typically say we need about 50 grams of carbs per hour, which a lot of coaches will talk about it in calorie terms. So if anybody's listening and they're like, what is that? Like your coach will probably say, you need to take 200 calories an hour. Same thing, right? So I think the other thing that's been really interesting is when you look at some of these runners that are running faster. So like the Breaking 2 project, right? Like it's rumored that, Kipchoge took 90 grams of carbs per hour. So this has kind of brought to light the faster we're running, we might actually need more carbs than 50 grams an hour, right? Like if some of the elites that I work with take a gel, which is 25 grams of carbs every 5K, and you know how fast they're running. So they're getting, 70, maybe even 80 grams of carbs an hour. So it's not, quite as cut and dry as 50 grams of carbs, but if you're not taking in at least 50 grams of carbs, no matter what your pace is per hour, I'd like to try to get you there.
So what if I'm going out for a workout and let's say it's just over an hour, maybe an hour and 15 minutes, something like that. If I get in 50 grams of carbs before I go out, is that sufficient?
So that's where it gets a little dicey. Like technically 60 minutes, 70 minutes, we should be okay without taking anything on that run. And and depending on what the workout is. So if it's fast paces, right? If it's threshold or faster, we're not going to digest very well during. So a lot of those shorter workouts that are at a higher intensity that are around 60 or 70 minutes, to your point, we might actually do better just fueling really well before and after and not worrying about during. I usually try to get people to make sure that they're really practicing fueling on like marathon pace workouts or maybe even a little bit faster. And then those shorter workouts that might even push over the hour, but that are a little faster, we just kind of focus around it.
So that's like, say, a 10-mile run. And even if you're saying if you're running that at a tempo pace, you don't necessarily need to fuel for that during the run.
10 miles is kind of where I'm like, should we? Right. So that's where I kind of take it into other factors too. Like how well are you eating around? Like I have some runners that I know just don't eat well before their runs. So I'm like, we're taking a gel out there. That's the negotiation, right? If we're not going to eat enough before, we're taking a gel while we're out there. Whereas I have some runners that I know are going to do just fine and we can plow through that and be perfectly strong. So I think a little bit of that is kind of dependent on fueling around and, overall goals too.
So the moral of that story is carry a gel with you. But by the time you feel like you need it, it's too late anyway.
It is. Yeah, but I love it when people just take one in their pocket and like, just in case they need it, right? Because I think I think it was just this past weekend. I was, a shorter long run that was super easy pace. And partway through it, I was like, I need a snack. But I didn't have anything on me. We were too far away. You know what I mean? So I think sometimes you think like, oh, I'm going to be okay on this run. But I really needed a snack. I wish I had some shoes in my pocket or something. So I think sometimes it's nice to just have that. Was that you yesterday?
Oh my God. I was like, I wasn't planning on going out as far as I went, but I was like, I feel good. I'll just keep going. The last 3 miles, I was like, that was a mistake.
Right? If you had that gel, it could have revived you.
Exactly.
In terms of carbs fluctuating during training, when you're coming off of training, weight loss, weight maintenance, it all sort of fluctuates with your activity.
Yeah, absolutely. And not to be afraid of not eating carbs when we fluctuate lower, right? I think just because we're not running or not running as much, or we want to lose some weight when we're not running as much, please still eat some carbs, right? But sure, we can absolutely scale them back dramatically, maybe even a third from where we were.
Sort of like drinking water. You don't need to drink as much if you're not out in the hot sun running, but you still need to drink water.
Thank you, Thomas. Another great analogy.
There we go. I'm full of it.
Nailing it.
All right. So this was cool because we got down to the thing that I think carbs have become like a dirty word. And we're trying to, at least my learning from Feathers is carbs aren't a dirty word. And you should be eating carbs. And they're part of a diet that will help you perform better. So the sooner you get over your head trash about carbs, the better you're going to perform. You're not going to get fat. Right, Feathers?
100%. We don't have to fear any of it. We need it all, right? We just need to figure out what that amount is for different aspects of our training.
So if somebody has another question that doesn't have anything to do with carbs, what should they do?
They should go to the Anchor app and send us an audio message, and we will answer your question here on the show.
Yep. Feathers will probably have the most intelligent answers, but I will chime in.
Send them on over, guys. Don't be shy.
All right, cool. And we've gotten a lot of women asking questions. I know men also eat and exercise. So if there's guys out there and you're feeling a little timid about dropping in your question, don't. I want to know.
50% of the listeners are male.
That's interesting.
Mm-hmm. We're 50-50.
That is interesting.
Yeah.
So yeah, guys, submit your questions.
All right. That's it.